let's dive into today's presentation. We only have 1 hour, and so I want to fly a little bit on the whole introduction. But first, I want to say this is adaptive management practice in challenging time. Again, exploring the pros and cons. I am Sebastian Saa. I'm the Associate Director of Agriculture Research. And for today's session, I work on my role as moderator to share with you how 3 talent industry members are adapting their management practices in challenging times. So that being said, I would like to first allow each of the panelists to introduce themselves so they can tell us a little bit more who they are and what they do before we navigate into answering the more technical questions. So Garrett, could you start?
Good morning. My name is Garrett Bowman. I'm a third-generation almond farmer from the Modesto, greater Modesto area. Been farming there. Well, I grew up farming, got a farming degree at UC Davis, and came back and began working on our family operation in 1999 and began growing a farm management company. And so I've been doing that ever since. In the past, we've worked with almond board researchers over the years, including Sebastian when he did some work a long time ago on spur-bearing retention.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Brandon, would you like to go next?
Yeah, good morning. Brandon Rebiero with Gold Leaf Farming. By the way, these lights are really something, so I feel bad for all the speakers this week. I am from Modesto, California. Also, grew up in a small almond operation. My grandfather's 30 acres. He's 90, by the way, and still farms everything himself. I was just telling these guys he doesn't even let me help him hook up the mower. The guy's an animal. So that's where I got my passion for farming almonds. Obviously too small of a farm, to feed very many mouths. So went away to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, studied agronomy and the plant sciences, came back, was a PCA, and then through that started a farm management company. And then in 2017 started Gold Leaf Farming, where we farm almonds and pistachios throughout California and Arizona. And I'm also on the board of directors for the almond board.
Thank you, Brandon. Franz?
Thank you. I'm Franz Niederholzer. I'm a tree crop farm advisor with UC Cooperative Extension in Colusa and Sutter Yuba counties. I'm also the research coordinator at the Nichols Soils Lab in Arbuckle in Colusa County, and I work with Stan Cutter, our farm manager for decisions and practices on 160 acres of a research facility that has 80 acres of almonds in 8 different blocks, so it's very fractured, but that's the way you do research. And I work in applied research in nutrition, spray application, as a generalist in extension.
Thank you, Franz. And I gotta say, I have had the pleasure to interact with the 3 of them for a while. As Garrett was mentioning, he was involved in a couple of the orchards that I used to sample back in 2010. And Brandon is a board director member as well. And Garrett has been involved in the different committees over the year. So I think what they also have in common together with Franz is that they are all familiar with our production research portfolio and always ahead in innovating and trying to figure out how to remain efficient during these years. So along those lines, I think I brought a very heavy-loaded question for all of them that you can see here on the screen. What have I stopped doing or done differently as part of my management plan when times are tough? So Garrett, I was curious if you could start answering that question from an irrigation and nutrient management point of view.
Yeah, I thought maybe before I dive into the irrigation and nutrition management, I'd just make a few comments of from a higher level, looking at our business as a whole, because kind of what your goals are for your business drive maybe some of the decisions that you make. I come from a family that sells fertilizer and farm inputs. And I tell you, a family can put a lot of pressure on you and give you a lot of good reasons as to why you shouldn't cut any inputs. And so I get caught in the middle here of trying to satisfy my customers' needs and keep the peace at family Christmas. But there is a lot of truth to not knowing what inputs to cut. As good businessmen and stewards of the land and environment, we've been applying what the trees need. We're monitoring for our pests and only treating when necessary. And so trying to figure out what you're going to cut becomes a difficult situation. And as good businessmen, we also know that we can't keep operating multiple seasons with our P&L in the red. And so simple math tells you that to move your P&L out of the red, you either increase production or income or decrease your inputs or your expenses. And then we get caught in this paradox that says to increase production, you might need to increase your inputs, or to decrease your inputs may result in less production. So we've kind of taken looking at our operation as a whole with the idea of trying to make strategic surgical type cuts, kind of like a minimal invasive surgery, if you will. When you have a minimal invasive surgery, there's still some recovery, but it's much shorter. Whereas if you have like a full-blown open heart surgery, there's lots and lots of recovery that has to take place. And so our goal is to make small cuts as needed, try to implement current research that can help us run more efficiently. So moving specifically into like the irrigation side, we are fortunate to, or I'm fortunate to live in an area that water and power is in ample supply and it's not available at exorbitant costs. And so we feel that one way to help minimize tree stress and tree health long-term is to keep our water at 100%. And so that is something that we are doing, is we are not backing off on our water in an attempt to save cost. But that being said, then we are relying on things like automation, just simple, cheap time clocks where available that can start and stop your pumps without you being present. We can irrigate multiple times a week if necessary, start fertilizer, and we don't have to make a trip to that ranch each time those activities are happening. Where on ranches where we have multiple varieties, we are utilizing things like dual submains. We're finding out that maybe some of the pollinator varieties could use more water than our non-Perel. And so trying to set our irrigation systems up in a way that we can optimize the tree health of one variety without compromising tree health of another variety. We use soil moisture sensors real time to ensure that we're not moving water and fertilizer past the root zone, and that the root zone is not drying out too much in between irrigations. We're also utilizing plant stress sensors to ensure that the trees are seeing the water that we're putting on. Now, as we try to perhaps save some money on the plant stress sensors in particular, we're taking a look at all of our ranches this year, perhaps reducing the amount that we have in the field, moving them over to the pollinators, because pollinators, we're finding out, seem to be a little more sensitive to water stress than our non-Perel. And so we're reducing the density of some of those sensors. I feel like we can still get the same information with a little bit of a reduced cost. And then on the irrigation, just the final point I'd make on that is keeping a consistent irrigation maintenance schedule to ensure that we keep a high distribution uniformity, that so we know that the trees are getting the same amount of water, the same amount of fertilizer, and trying to help just keep our efficiency at a high level. So moving into nutrient management, I would say one of the things that is driving our thinking there is to try to avoid the just-in-case type of thinking. You know, I'm going through putting on a spray. Well, I'll just add some zinc just in case. Kind of going back to our analysis, reviewing the critical values that we have, and if all the nutrient levels are where we want them, to perhaps delay or skip an application. And then treating each orchard according to the analysis that we're getting, along with yield potential. So not necessarily making big blanket cuts. If I have an orchard with high yield potential, we may make little cuts. But on an older orchard that's on its way out, we may make much larger cuts. So again, trying to strategically cut where needed or where we can without detrimental long-term effects. And I would say one example, especially of the just relying on our analysis is in the past, we've typically always done a post-harvest nutrient spray. And so this year we sat down on our leaf analysis, reviewed our levels, and if everything was sufficient, including boron from the holes, then we skipped it. But there was some ranches that boron was low, and we went ahead and did that fall spray. Another thing that we're doing with potassium levels, if our leaf levels have been good, our soil levels are good, we're delaying winter applications till the spring so we can see what kind of crop we have and then adjust at that point. With nitrogen, we are experimenting some with high frequency applications, fertilizing once a week and trying to gain some efficiency. Perhaps we could reduce our rate slightly, watching our leaf analysis in conjunction with that. We also suspect that some of the hybrid rootstocks seem to be much more efficient with nitrogen, and again, kind of playing with some rates, watching our leaf analysis at the same time. And then finally, I would say in regards to fertilization, implementing the practices that are in the Ammon Board's best management practices for nitrogen, the 4 R's, making sure that our fertilizer is going on at the right time, applying nitrogen in the spring when there's leaves on the tree and there's a demand, the right rate, perhaps a spoon feed, taking yield analysis, making a yield estimate in the springtime, and then adjusting our nitrogen based on that estimate, and making sure that the water's in the right place, which would refer back to distribution uniformity, and making sure that we're not moving the water past the root zone, and then the right source. And again, playing a little bit with thinking of the right source with the high intensity fertilization. I'm kind of wondering if more of a nitrate type fertilizer might be a better fit there, but continuing to watch that. So I think that's,
yeah, thank you.
At that.
That's really impressive. I think, in 10 minutes or so, you cover a ton of different strategies to increase efficiency in the area of irrigation and nutrients. You talk about automation, you talk about the DU test, you talk about the soil tree sensors, how you're maximizing their use, the movement from episodic to continuous fertigation. That was some discussion yesterday about that as well, how automation helped you on that. So again, this conference connecting the dots, so making a connection with what we presented yesterday in the morning, where we have Thomas Harter from UC Davis as well as Patrick Brown talking about experiments that they were carrying and looking how when you move from episodic to continuous, you can increase the efficiency up to 80%. So all that data that they were showing yesterday actually came from those ranches, from the ranches that he's talking about. So it's real practical data, practical information, and it's experience as well. We haven't looked yet into the hybrids rootstocks, but we're just starting to discuss that with our stakeholders, and it's very informative also that you suspect that there is even more efficiency that we can gain by looking into how rootstocks uptake nutrients and water. So thank you for sharing those insights, and I invite everybody here to think about questions. There's, again, a lot of information here that they are sharing. So take notes as they speak, and we can always go back to these topics. Again, automation, DU test, soil tree sensors, episodic continuous, etc. So let's now move a little bit from nutrient. Maybe we can start with Brandon, follow up with that conversation about potassium. And I know Brandon can share a lot about insect control or disease and weed management. So Brandon, would you like to take it over now?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, in general, my philosophy is quite similar. It's really about cutting defense, but not offense. And by offense, I mean fertility and water. Don't touch it. Because oftentimes when you try to cut in those areas, the lack of crop and the lack of revenue far outweighs any money saved. So you're, tripping over dollars trying to save pennies. So the P&L's got to improve, but we all know I'm a farmer. In addition to my, grandfather's orchard and the gold leaf stuff, I have my personal orchard my brothers are partners in, and it happens to be right on the road that everyone drives by. So I think we often forget about the emotional side of farmers, myself included, in that, there's a pride factor of your orchards. And I think there's this emotional aspect that we have to remove to get through these difficult times and then go back to the normal playbook. I'm sorry, excuse me. So a couple examples would be potassium that I'll touch on. I think, the standard quite often is 500 pounds of SOP in the fall. And sorry if there's any big SOP manufacturers in here, but I think that's pretty flawed in most cases. And the reason I say that there's a couple reasons. One's agronomic, one's economic. From an agronomic standpoint, if you put out your 500 pounds of SOP, you're probably forecasting a 2,500 pound crop next year. Well, what happened last year when we had a frost event? Everyone puts out their 500 pounds of SOP, and then boom, frost happens, you got 100 pounds on the tree, so you just totally overfed the tree. From an agronomic perspective, it's just less efficient. So I've switched more to in-season liquid potassium, various forms. In general, I would say, low pH soils, potassium carbonate, because it's higher in pH, high pH soils, KTS, and there's lots of other forms I could speak about later. But the beauty of that is you can adjust on demand as needed. So I like to go through yield milestones. February, how was bloom? March, how's it looking? April, how's nutlet formation? And all these check-ins. And then when we have these check-ins, we should have a good sense of, first of all, yield prediction is impossible, but you'll know like, hey, I'm north of my prediction or I'm south of my prediction, or it's a total, disaster and at a frost event or bacterial blast like we had this year. Then you can curtail spending and you can curtail your input in potassium. And I found it to be quite efficient. In part of my agronomy life, there was a researcher I worked really closely with, and we found it to actually be better from a yield perspective also, using the liquid forms. The other thing I'll talk about is NOW, and obviously a terrible year for NOW within the industry. One interesting point you may or may not have heard, so we have acres from Sacramento down to Bakersfield, some of which is organic, and we have 3 processors, and every Friday I call these processors and I say, hey, how's it looking out there? Give me the good, the bad, and the ugly. And early on, there was lots of NOW coming in. This is not looking good, not looking good. Well, the year finaled out, and what's interesting is the organic blocks, not just ours but others, have the lowest incidence of NOW damage, which is crazy. Not what I would have expected. And the only thing I can sort of isolate this variable is we absolutely have to sanitize in organic. It's not an option. And this was a very wet year, so we know a lot of folks who would normally sanitize just could not get in the fields, hence the incubation we had throughout the valley. But we made sure the organic orchards got sanitized, even if we had to hand pull, like they were done. And not all the conventional acres were that way. The other thing, which I think is a big driver, is pheromone-based mating disruption and the puffers. And I'm not a stockholder of any of these companies, by the way, but I'm convinced that these are highly, highly effective. And gun to head, if I could just have my budget sprays versus sanitation puffers, it would be sanitation and puffers. I like to do a hull split spray if it works, but quite alarming how effective the puffers have been for us. And I am now shifting a strategy going into this year. We're going to see more puffers even in our conventional. And I wouldn't view that as an additive cost. I'm going to cut out some sprays as a result of that, provided I sanitize. So I think there's some trade-offs there to think about. And the next topic I'll cover is weeds. And I call it pretty versus practical. Back to my, home orchard. Everyone drives by. Of course, you want it nicely manicured, and there's a pride factor there. But guess what? Like, having a nicely weed-free orchard doesn't really make money at the end of the day. If it's a jungle, you know you're gonna have added cost with the sweepers and hand rake and get it out. But for the most part, it's really not gonna drive profitability. So we're switching more to a mow program, and a really exotic, right? Not mowing super low to stir up dust. But what I've learned in the organic side is you can have a nice fuzz all year long, and it's not gonna mess up your harvest. You don't have to go through and chem mow all the time and spend a bunch of money there. We're also, this is conventional I'm speaking to, we use a lot of mechanical weeding devices in organic, and we're gonna start adopting those tools into conventional. You know, we already own the tractors, we already own the mowers, we have to go through. So it's not really an added expense. And as most of you know, like a lot of us, myself included, like to complain about labor cost and minimum wage. But at the end of the day, that does not move the needle on your budget. It's really a third of your budget is FERT and chem. So going through a few more times, most of these guys are already on your payroll. So you're gonna pay for their time anyways. And you know, that's a couple $100 of savings that we ripped out of the budget just by not doing a lot of weed control from a chemical perspective. And then, you know, maybe some examples of cutting on defense and offense versus offense. I think you got to think about your economic thresholds. We studied this at Cal Poly. You know, the UC IPM is great about this, but when almond prices are north of $2, no one really thinks about economic thresholds. It's more of like your insurance policy, go through your playbook, just do what you got to do. Well, you can't do that in these times. So I like to think about the cost benefits and the trade-offs. So one example I would use is an NOW treatment program. Let's say you have a 2,000 pound crop. I'm gonna do this math in my head if I can. I see Wes aside, so correct me if I'm wrong here on the math. 2,000 pound crop, and let's say if you're not gonna spray, I'm not gonna do any NOW sprays in the summer. And I think if I do that, I'm gonna get 5% damage. That's 100 pounds of crop gone, times $2 a pound is $200 of revenue. So you have to think about my cost of my treatments should be less than $200 an acre, or that does not have a positive return on investment. And I think that mindset is not like instinctive for most of us, but I think you have to start taking more risk on defense. And the philosophy I believe in offense versus defense is never sacrifice on yield, because that has a long-term cumulative effect. We've seen Goldhammer's work on deficit irrigation 1-to-1 the first year, but it's even worse the second year. I'll repeat that. So like in the current year, 1-to-1 ratio, if you cut your water 10%, it's like 10% less yield. It gets worse the next year. In fact, I think it's like almost 2x. So you don't want to cut on those things. Similar with fertility. Up until about June to June 10th, we begin farming for next year's crop because we're going into bud differentiation. We're trying to store carbohydrates for the next year's bloom. So if you cut, you're really hurting yourself from a long-term perspective, and it takes years to get out of that hole. From a chemical perspective and the defensive strategy, typically it's very annual. It may not look pretty. You may have some defoliation from mites. You may have some ugly weeds. You may get rust, scab, but there's a lot of tools in the shed that you can use next year. You may have to beef up your spray program to take care of any, inoculum from some of the diseases and so forth. So I think it just takes a critical analysis of every event through your playbook. What's the ROI? What are the trade-offs? Can I take risk? My view is take risk on quality versus yield. In a perfect world, you don't want to take any of that risk, but when push comes to shove, that's where I prefer to do it. Then the last thing before I transition over is Dave Wheeler in here? He used to always say, water is the cheapest thing in the tank. And that always stuck with me. So when you're making these spray applications, make sure you have sufficient coverage, 100, 150, 200 gallons, and go slow. Speed does not kill. So, against conventional wisdom, speed does not kill. Lots of data out there on spray coverage and the efficacy of reaching the tops of the trees. So we're spending the money on these inputs. We better make damn sure that every drop is getting on the tree. And going a little bit slower, again, does not move the needle on diesel, does not move the needle on labor. My business partner, he's the bean counter. He gets in all the Excel stuff, and like, it's insignificant. So go slow, get good coverage, and get the most efficacy. Water is the cheapest thing in the tank, so make sure you get everything covered.
Thank you, Brandon. Again, a lot of insights there, sharing everything all the way from potassium, liquid fertilizers, Navy Ranch worm, weed management, and your approach of flex on the fence, no offense kind of thing. So, I mean, I guess I'm shocked about your points about potassium as well, that the risk of front loading, when like you still don't know how many pounds you're going to produce. If you put all your potassium, I guess the same logic with nitrogen, if you front load, then you don't have an opportunity to adjust. So I think that really struck to me. And also your point about the thresholds. You're constantly looking at if does it bring me the return on investment that I'm looking with this application. And as prices have gone down and your plots may not have the potential yield that you were expecting, that threshold changes in every block. And it's so a treatment that may make sense from an economic point of view, as you were pointing, may work for some of your blocks, but may not work for the other blocks either because of the current price times the multiplication of your actual yields. So very good insight. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to move now to Franz to continue. You end up there talking about a spray. The water is the cheapest thing in the tank. I like that. And Franz, I don't know if you will continue to talk a little bit about more spray coverage and preparing for harvest and post-harvest as well.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'll add a little bit to the great information I just heard. This is hard to do. At least it's that way for me. Echoing the points that have been made about making sure when things are tight and when spending any money is challenged, it's hard to write checks. Whatever you do has to be the best you can do. You're not, well, we sprayed. No, we sprayed at 2 miles an hour at 150 gallons or 200 gallons. We got a nurse tank going. So if you're spraying at 100 gallons an acre or 200 gallons an acre at 2 miles an hour, your 2 mile an hour speed is the same, whether the volume doesn't affect your ground speed. So if you can make your turnaround times faster, you don't lose time on the filling. There are all kinds of data showing at hull split, if you go 150 to 200 gallons an acre, you're going to get better control. And that savings, that improvement in your quality is going to more than pay for the inputs, the changes in programs you needed to get the job done right. If you making sure you do everything as well as you can is hugely important. It's been talked about. I'll talk real briefly about irrigation. David Dahl's pointed out in some of his research, you can lose 10% of your yield with water stress in the summertime. Just making sure your irrigation is being done properly, as most of my colleagues up here have suggested, that's 10%, could be earning you 5 to 10% just by perhaps a little bit of an increase in your inputs into irrigation. So with spraying, particularly when the rubber meets the road in difficult years like this with navel orangeworm, and where we work, if we have to spray navel orangeworm, there's lots of abandoned fields around us. Sanitation is critical. Polling would be critical. Mating disruption would be a tremendous addition. And then applications in our area, because our orchards can be very clean, but across the road, our neighbor may not be. So timing early on, all the good PCAs I've talked to prefer, and Joel Siegel with his research experience from USDA, better to be on early than late to get good effective control. 100 gallons per acre in some of the tests I've run, and I think the same with Joel, you're not much different between, your control isn't much different between unsprayed and when you spray with 100 gallons an acre. You just cannot get complete coverage of that. There's literally acres of leaves and target in a tree, in an acre of orchard. If you don't have enough paint, in the can to cover that surface area, you're not going to get the results you want. It has to be done slowly so that the turbulent coverage occurs. So drive slowly, plenty of volume. This year, with things tight, we went from 100 gallons an acre to 150 just by changing our loading site. So those are important. And to the flip side, at bloom, where you don't have canopy you're trying to push through, every other row spraying works through pink. But if you're trying to save money by going every other row at full bloom, it will cost you. You will not have complete control. You will not get the control you expect. So every row after pink bud is critical to effective control. You can drive, at that time, you can drive a little bit faster because you're not trying to push that spray through the heavy laden canopy you're spraying at hull split. So you can pick up some speed there, but you have to slow down once March arrives and the canopy fills in. But there is some benefit to be made there, certainly better than every other row spraying by driving a little bit faster every row. So that's a quick run through on spraying and calibration, checking leaks and making sure you blow out the sprayer. I like to blow out the sprayer between every major application because you're going to find plugged screens. You're going to find things that impact the whole job. Just paying attention to what you do, and making sure what you do is done as carefully and as correctly as you can. Harvest, timing is critical to getting set up. Making sure you're clearing the trees and you're not shaking too early, not in a hurry to beat the worms, and shaking the trees too hard with green nuts and creating damage that is real trouble in the long term. I'm not going to add a whole lot to the harvest information. I don't want to cut into the conversation, but again, making sure the steps to take, that they're all done as carefully and as thoughtfully as possible.
Mm-hmm. What about priming the trees in preparation for harvest?
Thank you. Drying down. Depending upon your irrigation system, you can with drip you can get in quite quickly to shake. And again, taking care to not shake them. Make sure that you're 100% hull split throughout the orchard, so your operator's not running into sections that are greener, and in an effort to clean those green nuts because the last few rows were coming off. Why aren't these shaking them too hard and barking? Mm-hmm. That's the saddest thing to see in a new orchard is 4 trees in a row that got barked, because that's in 120 trees for acre, 124 trees an acre. You can ruin an orchard pretty quickly. Those are those small things that need to be considered. That's not getting you through this year, but it's part of the long-term process of successful farming.
Could you also share a little bit about post-harvest applications of nutrients? I know you had done some studies. It's as we move into more continuous fertigation, especially we may have applied a bit more than what we thought we were going to produce. Yeah. Any thoughts along those lines? You have studies in that area.
Yeah, thank you. We used to apply post-harvest nitrogen, small amounts. The trees don't use very much at all if they need it, but we did some studies a few years back in orchards with adequate summer leaf nitrogen levels. We did not see any economic benefit, no crop improvement the following year to 30, 40, 60 pounds of N per acre. So we stopped putting on fall nitrogen. This year we put a little bit of urea in the spray tank with boron, because we are low in boron in our area, especially on the peach almond hybrids, which tend to not pick up as much boron. So we do October when there's still a solid leaf canopy. In our area, which with clean groundwater, we need boron. Even those blocks that have where the boron's creeping up, we do put some on just to make sure we don't miss any. I imagine Garrett and Brandon probably put some on in season. We to date haven't, so that's part of the reason we try to catch up a little bit in the fall. But that fall application is helpful, and again in wet spots and with hybrid rootstock, we do look at a phosphite or something to help protect us in the low spots where we could run into phytophthora issues if it's a wet winter.
Thank you, Franz. So again, more insights about spray coverage and preparing for harvest, and also what experiments are saying in terms of post-harvest application. So thanks for sharing that. I do have more questions for them, but I do want to also open it for questions from you or comments. You all can see the question on the screen. We're all on this together. And I would also like to, maybe if you just want to comment on something that you have observed along the same lines or different lines that they have shared, I think that will also be beneficial and interesting to discuss today. So any questions or comments? Don't be shy. Okay, there's one there. Roger? Okay, so I'll repeat the question. So he's asking about yield prediction and how can you estimate how much to produce? And I think it's to you, Garrett, but also Brandon mentioned how he needs to reevaluate his thresholds based on how much he's going to produce. And I think so. As I say, we're working in that area from a research point of view. We still don't have the answer. So I'm also curious how you estimate it these days.
Well, I think at this point, crop estimation is more of an art than a science, which highlights the need for more research, I think, to be able to make accurate estimations. Currently, when I walk into a field, I carry a 5-year yield, my history for the last 5, 6, 7 years, and just go by experience what I'm seeing and write down a number. And some years I think I'm pretty good. Some years I'm terrible.
But even when you think you're terrible, are you talking of 1,000 pounds error, 500 pounds error?
Yeah, maybe 15 or 20% off. Sometimes it's 50% off.
Okay, but that's sometimes. But
yeah,
most of the time you are between 15 and 20%. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, maybe slightly better than that.
I guess what I'm trying to go with my follow-up here is that it's still better than going blind. Still better, even if you are wrong or not exactly where you think you have to be, it's still better than going blind and thinking that you're going to get all the time those 4,000 pounds. Anyway, Brandon?
Yeah, great question. And to me, like as far as research goes in the ag tech space, that would be the holy grail. If someone could predict yield methodology early, because then you can curtail spending and not overapply any nutrients. But that doesn't exist. There's a few out there that have tried it and it's failed miserably, in my opinion. So we've tried different methods, Roger, over the last 10 years. We've done the very quantitative approach where we're counting if there's 4 scaffolds on a tree, we're counting 1 scaffold. That's a representative sample, multiplying by 4 trees per acre, and then weighing them out. And then and it wasn't very accurate. And I followed all the methodology to T. Then I switched to the thumb in the air. Way more accurate. Crazy, right? I was so mad at myself for all the hours I spent like a monkey in a tree counting all these damn nuts. So what we do now is Ryan Hackett, who's sitting right behind you, him and I go through the portfolio in March and May, and we have like the forecasted yield when I built these fertility programs in the fall, what we thought it was going to be for next year, and we do a low, medium, high. We both go in together. I would recommend going in with someone else. Do a low, medium, high assessment, but don't talk to each other. Don't open the kimono and say, what do you think? Because then it'll influence. Whether you say it's not going to influence, it definitely does. So we do low, medium, high, and we usually use that mid-range as like, this is going to be our forecast. And this year, yields were not great throughout the state, and in most cases, we were between 200 to 300 pounds in either band. And I'm happy with that. If we can get within 500, I'm happy with that. I wish we could get closer.
Franz, you want to add anything about that?
To yield estimate?
To the yield part?
Other than I asked the speakers, do you guys use the leaf analysis as if the crop is the biggest source of at least nitrogen and potassium, do you use leaf analysis to give you as part of the equation?
Yeah, certainly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we're deficient in something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, can I add one more thing on that?
Yeah.
Like,
go ahead.
So that my method versus a quantitative method goes back to the almond board's subjective versus objective. And for those that don't know, the objective is where the monkeys go in the trees, if you will, and count everything. And it's like very thorough process from north to south in the state. And they came up with their yield estimate. The subjective is where they literally call a bunch of growers and say, what do you think you got on the tree? 2,500 pounds. Guess what? Over like the 20 to 30 year average, guess which one is more accurate? Subjective, the phone calls. So don't underestimate your ability to have good instincts on your orchard, because you're going to know your orchard's better than anyone else.
Well said. I guess I do want to offer a little bit more about that area because, as you pointed out, that would be the holy grail, kind of like understanding how much we're going to produce. And in discussion with our stakeholders, with you and many others too, that became a priority in our research portfolio. And we are actively tackling that priority. We have assembled a multidisciplinary team from UC Davis to and UCNR, et cetera, to tackle and understand in a practical way how we can predict actual yields. We're still working on that, so hang in there, but I want to just give you the heads up that that's a little bit how we're also using our resources. In the past, we use our resources to estimate the potential yield, the maximum amount of pounds that you could get in a given area. And we were able to understand that it was then a really clear function of the tree size. So the bigger the trees, the more the light interception that you have, the more you cover, the more is that potential. So up to like 80%. So if you have, if you walk at the middle of the summer, your orchards, and they are covering about 80% of the space or the light interception, that potential, that roof is about 4,000 pounds, for instance. So that's your potential. Okay, doesn't mean you're gonna get there. We still don't know the actual yield, but we can adjust as well throughout the season. So even that just simple rule of thumb that looking at the size of the tree should give you a sense, and we have that data when you're working those orchards that are 60% or 50% covering their light interception, the amount of shade that you see walking in the middle of the summer. It will give you a sense of the potential, not the actual yield, which we need, but it will be a good indicator again, and it will be better than just going blind. So I just wanted to add those 2 cents as well. Good question. More questions and comments? Okay. Feel free if you guys want to walk to the mic. We have a mic there, or if you, I can repeat the question.
Yeah, good question. On the first point, the 1% damage threshold, I agree. History is the best indicator, right? So history is the best indicator of damage. And if you know an orchard's problematic, you do it. And it is a bit of insurance, but you kind of know through experience that you're going to have problems in that orchard, so you do it. And a year like this, if you took it on the chin and you got a left hook and did not see it coming, I'm going to do the puffers next year. But there's no like sure prediction of I'm going to have this much damage other than history. So that's what I rely on. Well, the second question was yeah.
Spray.
So probably unpopular opinion here. I know we have the May spray that we're now calling the mummy spray. That's one I'm cutting out. I cut out last year. It's not a blind cut. We watch traps very closely, both egg and adult traps. We have a pretty good sense of, we run that over historical traps. So we have trend lines in Excel that shows week to week, year to date, how these traps were trending. And then at the end of the year, I always correlate that with damage. So we're trying to triangulate on our own. So these weekly trap counts over this period equal this much damage in 2008, for instance. So provided I'm not freaked out by the trap reports, I'll cut out the May spray. And then in a lot of cases, we've been doing bracket spraying on NOW, so it's becoming 2 sprays. We're cutting out the second one, so we're basically doing 1 hull split spray when we have puffers. And that was successful this year.
Thank you. There's another question there in the back. So the question was, unsanitized orchards present clear risk as a source of inoculum for Navel worms or other diseases. What options do we have in that sense? Correct? Everybody's looking at me.
I mean, I can share what I've done. Puffers is the first thing that comes to mind. It's going to help. It's not foolproof. And then almost like a war, we spray the borders a lot more. So we'll go through almost every 2 or 3 weeks and wrap the borders. Off the record, occasionally the outside spray boom may loft into the neighbor's orchard on occasion. I don't know. But anyways, so we wrap the borders as much as we can. We do puffers, and you're certainly going to get some damage. There's no silver bullet. You're going to take it. In one case, we actually tried to work with the neighbor and offered to do some sanitation for him, offered to do some spraying for him on the adjacent rows. We didn't spray the whole ranch, but hey, can we spray your 20 rows on the outside? And we think that helped.
We also, I mean, it's not exactly that, but we also have a neighborhood program that you can visit on our website where we try to connect the neighbors that may qualify for the use of Navel worm mating disruption. So then we can create a polygon of small plots that then if they all implement mating disruption, that would be beneficial for the whole community, including them. So I think building from talking with the neighbor, that's one of the practice that we're trying to move forward as well. Good question. Any more questions or comments? Over here.
You were talking about 100 gallons to the acre on spraying now. If you use an electric blast rig, is that still as effective? I mean, say a 50 gallon an acre rate. I know some people are going less than that. I seem to still get good control of that 50 gallons an acre. Have you found that that doesn't work? Or is it still stringent on that 100 gallons an acre or more?
So Franz, you done research in that area. Could you repeat the question a little bit and then I'll share your thoughts?
The question was, and this regarding hull split sprays, the use of electrostatic sprayers, lower spray volumes. My experience, the electrostatic sprayers work great as a foliar application. You're getting small droplets and you're covering a uniform flat surface leaves. I have some research I've done, and I think Brad Higbee, when he worked with Paramount, came up with the same results. There wasn't the coverage in the tops of the trees that was needed, and you have to drive slowly. So the research we did at Nichols plus the other, you don't get as good a control with low gallonage and electrostatics, especially if you're following the 4 miles an hour and 50 gallons an acre sort of thing. That has a good fit at other times, but in my experience, it will yield less, poorer results than 150 gallons at 2 miles an hour. And many of the electrostatic sprayers have, dilute booms and ways of applying higher gallonage, and you have to slow down too. But one size fits all through the whole season with any of those systems doesn't yield you the results you're looking for in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Could I comment one thing? We did a study on that just internally, and the question was, he said he's been getting good results, basically going 50 gallons an acre in essence, at 1.9, nice and slow. He's got good results at 50 GPA. We did the water sensitive paper through the tree. So we set up these yellow 3x5 cards and put them up from the trunk all the way to the top. Did it in various spots, and we sent in the conventional sprayers and the electrostat. And what we found is it's really all about air displacement, which is why you have to go slow. So if you think about you're driving down the row, you're constantly displacing this air with power to force it up through the tree. And so the electrostats, they have the positive charge to bond to the negative. I get all that, but it doesn't solve for air displacement and getting high in the canopy. So when we looked at these cards on engine-driven rigs, PTO rigs, and then the electrostat, equalizing for speed and GPA. Engine rig had the highest, all the way to the tops of the trees, full coverage. Next was the PTO, similar, but not quite as good. And from about mid-canopy up, the electrostat just couldn't get up there. Below that, the coverage is great. But I agree, like later in the season, you just can't force that air through to get high enough in the canopy.
Thank you for those thoughts too. More questions or comments? So, we have covered. Oh, there's one there. Okay. I was
Thank
going
you.
to. I had it open.
I was shocked that didn't come up either.
I was going to mention that as actually I'm gonna build from there. We talked yesterday a lot about pruning, and here we're talking a lot about very critical practices as well. And I wanted again connect the dots from yesterday to today with pruning. On Friday, I sent a survey via our online magazine In the Orchard, asking to you guys, to our grower community, if you prune or not. That was the first question, okay? And then if you prune, the question was, do you prune to just clean your orchard for equipment passes so they can pass, no problem? So like a cleaning pruning, so it doesn't interferes with orchard operation. So that was one option. And the other option was, do you prune with the goal of enhancing light interception and productivity? Okay, that was on Friday. And also, how many times have you pruned in the last 5 years, to get a sense of what we're talking about here? The biggest population of the answers say they prune, most of them, like 90%. Then how often they prune? The biggest group, the majority does it twice. The second majority did it 3 times in the last 5 years. And when I asked them, do you prune just for cleaning, or do you prune to enhance productivity, or with the goal of enhancing productivity in your mature crops? 46% say they did not do it only for cleaning, they also do it for enhancing productivity. So only 54 does it for just cleaning, 46 does it for enhancing productivity. And our results are pretty clear there. What Roger was showing yesterday, that option of enhancing productivity doesn't really pan out. You, Roger, I don't know if you want to share, you have the mic there. Again, a little bit of the highlights of your results, how much you save.
Can I give Roger credit? I have 1 minute, I'll comment. So for those of you who don't know, Roger has probably my favorite study in the whole state. I think it's 19 years going, 20?
It was 20.
It's Eastern Stanislaus County. It's a great orchard. Bottom line, pruning does not pay. Pruning does not pay. Pruning does not pay. Pruning does not pay. Why? It adds costs, unnecessary costs, and it reduces yield. That's like the worst storm you ever want to be in. Look at his study. I won't recite the whole thing, but basically you prune up to year 3, train the tree, and let her rip after that. Any cuts you're going to make is for field access. You got a big limb coming across, it's going to knock a guy off the tractor or the 4-wheeler, cut that off. If the tractor can't get through, cut it off. But just do surgical cuts here and there. The way we do it is our irrigators in the wintertime, they need work. We don't lay people off in the winter. They just go through. We prefer the tractor drivers because they're the ones who know like what's going to be a pain. They go through and they make select cuts. We don't give them pole saws because that's easy and gets really fun to make a lot of cuts. But surgical cuts, and don't touch it. And you're not going to have the best manicured orchard in the neighborhood. It's not your front yard, though. It's a business. So that drives the best yields, and we've seen the results. And his study is incredible, so look at it. Every year the yields are better in the minimal pruned. Prune up to year 3, don't touch them after that.
Yeah, well said, Brandon. Again, moving a little bit from that emotional component that you were sharing before, from the pretty to the more practical aspect. Definitely pruning during mature orchards after training is one of those ones that we can put aside. More questions or comments? Yep. So the question is if you could touch on cover crops, water saving, thoughts, costs about cover crops. Maybe Garrett?
I don't have a lot of experience with cover crops. what I've the little bit that I have, I've not seen a lot of water savings that I could plant them and say I can now change my practices. Normally when we've planted them, it's just been to try to help keep the soil open and deal with compaction type issues, just to kind of help it along, but not, it doesn't change our watering or fertility per se.
So we're covering all this production chain, the main cost. I want to make sure we try to cover all of them. So thank you for bringing cover crops. Other ones that we haven't talked here, but have been talked in other sessions is whole rot, for instance, another pest that we have. I don't know if you have any thoughts that you want to share with whole rots. Another one that we haven't talked to is protecting those flowers, the sprays that you do during flowering. And the last one, maybe beehives, also another expensive cost in the orchard. So any thoughts about efficiencies that any of you may want to share? We just have 4 minutes left about those other critical topics that I mentioned. Brandon.
Well, I think hull rot is the most underrated disease there is. The other diseases we talk about a lot, scab rust, that's like short term, it's that year. Next year you might have some more inoculum, but you spray again. Think about hull rot. So we all know what hull rot is. It's the little bread mold. It looks nasty. Well, it's more than it looks nasty. That actually sends fumaric acid into the spur that it's attached to, and that spur dies and never comes back the next year. So we've all walked through orchards, older orchards, where from the ground at 15 feet high, there's no fruiting wood. That's just accumulation of hull rot. So you've lost what % of your canopy, and it's forever gone. That does not come back. Pruning doesn't help. More sunlight, it doesn't work. So you've permanently, reduced your yield potential for that orchard. Sprays are not that effective, in my opinion. I think the cultural ways is the way to go. We used to cut off all nitrogen by June 1st and have your leaf levels below the threshold, but now we're leaning more towards like May 15th. And then we're deficit irrigating during hull rot, measurable deficit irrigating, a combination of ET reduction, roughly 50% of ET, but also using pressure bombs to dial it in. That's been the most effective. But yeah, and the sprays, we try to do some sprays at hull rot, but I think the timing is so damn critical and the coverage. And even though they work in the lab on that particular pathogen, if you just relied on the sprays, it's much less effective than managing the environment.
Garrett, do you see what is the pressure pump?
Yeah, a pressure bomb. The researchers are probably going to butcher me for my interpretation of it, but you put it's like stem water potential. So you put a leaf in this device, and you squeeze it, and it creates a measurement.
Garrett, do you see a lot of hull rot in your ranches?
Yeah, I would say, again, the main way we're combating it is deficit irrigating. And I might just comment a little bit on nitrogen application. On the one ranch where we're doing the continuous fertigation, we're doing weekly fertigation. We're starting at about half leaf out, 70%. And we're actually running our nitrogen all the way into August, but it's very, very low amounts each week. And so far, we're not seeing any blow up in hull rot. I think those smaller amounts of nitrogen is probably helping with keeping that at bay, or at least not making it flame up.
How many units a week are you putting on through the summer like that?
Roughly 10.
Yeah, and then it's described there also in the nutrient management how continuous fertigation, as long as you follow the right rate over the overall season, is not going to increase hull rot. It's the excess of nutrient at the end that can later in the season that can produce that hull rot. So thanks for sharing that too. And Franz, anything about hull rot? Or
nitrogen.
I guess maybe if you want, we can talk about beehives. Yeah.
Late nitrogen, bigger slugs of late nitrogen does bring on hull rot. So, especially on vigorous rootstock. At least that's been our experience this last year. So we're going to look more carefully at the
balancing act.
The continuous fertilization.
Yep. Thanks. Well, we ran out of time, but I think we had a good flavor of how, again, 3 very talented industry members are dealing during these difficult times. So a big round of applause for them. as well.